"You made that, yourself." They asked and then burst out laughing, a crowd of design students at Parsons, New York. Everyone was dressed head to toe in luxury, and me, I wore an old denim dress, sewn by hand, using the machine my grandmother left behind. They laughed in my face. They pointed. They called me the project girl with thrift store dreams. I didn't argue. I just bowed my head and stitched another seam. 3 years later, on that very same runway at New York Fashion Week, my name was embroidered across the entire collection. My name is Alyssa James, and the first dress I ever made was from an old curtain I pulled down from our kitchen window. We lived in a cramped apartment in South Brooklyn, 2 rooms, peeling wallpaper, a sewing machine that belonged to my grandmother, rusty, loud, but it worked. I was 13, and I wanted to feel beautiful, not just pretty, not borrowed beauty from someone else's brand beautiful. I wanted the kind of beauty that said, I made this with my own hands. My mom was working night shifts as a nurse. My dad left when I was in 6th grade. All we had was each other and a pile of unpaid bills. But every time I sat down at that sewing machine, I felt powerful. Like I could create a world where fabric could turn into armor. Where I didn't need anyone to give me a name, I could stitch it myself. I applied to Parsons School of Design with a portfolio made of duct tape, thread, and hand-drawn sketches. I didn't think I'd get in, but I did. Full scholarship. I cried on the subway home when I read the acceptance email. But no one told me that being accepted doesn't mean you'll be welcomed. From the first week, I knew I didn't belong. Everyone wore Balenciaga sneakers and vintage Chanel jackets like it was nothing. Meanwhile, I was still wearing a thrift store coat with a missing button. They didn't say anything at first, just looks, then whispers, and then the comments began. "Oh, is that homemade, kind of cute, in a charity shop way? She's brave to show up in that." I kept quiet, not because I was weak, but because I didn't want to waste thread on people who couldn't see beyond a label. The first real blow came during our class critique. I had spent 3 weeks making a 2-piece set out of recycled denim. I patched it by hand. Every stitch had a story. When I stood up to present, I was nervous, proud, ready. And then Jenna Klein raised her hand, the daughter of fashion royalty, blonde, expensive, cruel. She smiled, tilted her head, and said, "Is this your final piece? I thought it was a mock-up." Laughter, a few stifled gasps. Even the professor didn't defend me. He just moved on. I stood there, holding the skirt I had stitched by candlelight during a blackout. And in that moment, I realized something. They don't care how much heart you put into something. They only care whose name is on the tag. But I had a secret. It wasn't money. It wasn't connections. It was grit. And I knew how to sew pain into purpose. So I kept quiet. I took the subway home, wiped my tears on the inside lining of my jacket, and promised myself one thing one day. They'll pay to wear what I create. And that day, I won't say a word. I'll just watch them applaud. In my designs. They didn't just laugh once. They made it a ritual. Every presentation, every critique, every time I showed something I'd spent weeks making, there was always a smirk, a whisper, a muttered joke under someone's breath. "She thinks patchwork is couture. Maybe she should design for a flea market. Bet she sleeps with a sewing kit under her pillow." They said it when they thought I couldn't hear. Sometimes they said it when they knew I could. I didn't respond. I didn't have time to defend myself. I was too busy sewing between shifts at the diner. Too busy walking to the fabric donation center after class while they Ubered to Fifth Avenue. Too busy living the kind of life they only read about in editorials. But every thread I stitched carried a piece of memory, of my mom coming home with aching feet, of lights cut off for a week because we couldn't pay the bill, of silence, thick and bitter, when I found out we'd lost the apartment below us. They called me budget girl, like it was an insult. But I wore it like armor, because when you've survived with nothing, you learn how to build everything. Then came the Parsons Winter Exhibition, a chance to be selected by visiting designers, eyes from Vogue, the kind of exposure you dream about, the theme reinvention. Each student had to reinterpret a classic silhouette with modern storytelling. They chose ball gowns, suiting, luxury fabrics. I chose trash bags. Yes, trash bags. Black polyethylene, lined with recycled cotton, pleated and structured into a high-slit gown that draped like silk but cost me $5 to make. I stayed up 3 nights, hand-painting each panel. One side of the gown was chaos scribbles, raw edges, burns, mismatched seams. The other side was elegance, precision, restoration. It told a story, my story, of growing up where nothing matched, where things were thrown away, where I was taught to hide the mess and only show the finished part. But this time, I showed it all. I didn't win. Jenna did. She always did. Her piece was a structured trench coat made of Italian wool. Perfect, polished, painless. They said mine was too conceptual, too raw, too uncomfortable. I smiled through the sting, but that night, as people left the hall, I noticed something. There was a group of younger students gathered near my piece, taking photos, whispering, but not mocking, appreciating. And I heard one of them say, "It's like she stitched honesty into fabric." That was the first time I ever felt seen, not for how expensive my materials were, but for the truth they carried. From then on, I started documenting every step of my process, filming late nights in my dorm, explaining techniques using scraps, telling stories of where my fabrics came from, what they used to be, and what they'd become. I posted it all online. No filters, no polish, just thread and truth. And something strange happened. People started watching. First it was 20 followers, then 200, then 2,000. One day, a fashion blogger reposted my gown from the winter exhibition, called it Street Couture Meets Survival. Overnight, my inbox flooded with messages, design students, single moms, even retired tailors from small towns. They didn't care that my clothes weren't on runways. They cared that my clothes told their stories too. The next semester, I asked if I could work independently, focus on a self-led collection. They hesitated, of course. But when they saw the engagement I was building online, they said yes. I moved out of campus housing, rented a room above an old dry cleaners in Queens, used their steam press at night in exchange for folding uniforms during the day. I turned that room into my first studio, a lamp, a desk, a mannequin I built from cardboard and masking tape. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And every design I made carried a truth I refused to silence. My tagline built from scraps, stitched for souls. My classmates still didn't take me seriously. Jenna said in front of everyone she thinks followers equal fashion. Cute. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because I had already sold 48 handmade jackets in under 2 months. Each one customized. Each one signed. Each one proving that I didn't need Vogue to validate me. I only needed the people I was sewing for. I still remember the day my first international order came in. A woman from Tokyo bought a trench I made from old canvas bags. She wrote in the note, "I saw myself in your story. Thank you for dressing us. The forgotten." I cried, not because I was weak, but because for the first time in my life, I felt powerful, not for fitting in, but for standing out on purpose. I didn't need their applause, but I wasn't going to lie, I still craved it, not for validation, but for victory, for every time I was laughed at, for every thread I stitched in silence while they mocked me in daylight. By the time graduation neared, my name had quietly begun floating through niche corners of fashion forums. People didn't call me a student designer. They called me an underground movement. And that title, that meant everything. Because it wasn't just about clothes anymore. It was about meaning, about standing up for those who couldn't afford to stand out. And the more noise I didn't make, the louder my work echoed. I launched my first full collection the summer after graduation. 7 pieces, all made in my tiny studio apartment in Queens. All inspired by the streets I grew up on: cracked pavement, fire escapes, laundromats, subway tile. I called it Concrete Bloom, because even weeds push through the sidewalk eventually. I didn't do a runway. I did a sidewalk show. Yes, literally. I recruited models through Instagram, real people, not professionals. Mothers, students, waitresses, activists. We shut down a single block in Brooklyn for 1 hour. Borrowed speakers, projected textures onto brick walls. I streamed it live. And by the end of the hour, Concrete Bloom was trending. Not because it was flashy, but because it felt like home for people who never saw themselves in Fashion Week. That same night, a buyer from a mid-size boutique in Manhattan DM'd me. She said she cried during the third look because the patchwork coat reminded her of her mother's blankets. We met the next day, and within a week, I had my first wholesale order. That money didn't go to luxury. It went into building the Alyssa James studio properly. I found a space in the Lower East Side. Nothing fancy, just exposed pipes, chipped floor tiles, and enough room for 3 sewing machines. I hired my first team, 2 women I met at a community sewing class. They were older, immigrants, and more talented than any graduate I knew. We worked late into the night, windows open, music on low, stitching stories into every sleeve. My designs were raw, loud, emotional, and unapologetically poor in material but rich in soul. Still, the old names from school didn't care. They laughed again. Jenna posted a TikTok saying some people turn trauma into trends. I prefer luxury. Her words stung, but they didn't stick, because they were hollow, and I had work to do. 1 month later, a stylist from a Netflix show reached out. They needed something gritty, real, Brooklyn-born. Guess who they chose? Me. The actor wore my hand-dyed hoodie in episode 4. No credits, no shout-out. But my DM exploded. Sales tripled overnight. And Jenna. She started copying silhouettes from my old Etsy listings. Revenge doesn't need to scream. Sometimes it just whispers, then outsells. 6 months in, we were barely keeping up with demand. I trained local teens to help package and ship orders. I created an internship program for high schoolers who'd never touched a sewing machine. I gave them the kind of space I never had, and in return, they gave me back a belief I didn't know I lost. That fashion could be community, not just competition. Then came the unexpected. A letter from the New York Fashion Council. I'd been selected as an emerging voice for their next showcase. Venue Bryant Park. Time fall season. Guest list 800 attendees, including all the major editors, buyers, influencers. I stood in my studio that day, holding the envelope. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a strange, poetic ache, because I realized something. They invited me to the table I was once denied, but I wasn't coming to sit. I was bringing my own damn chair. We prepared for months. Each look in the collection represented a moment they tried to erase me. A dress made from childhood curtains, a jacket lined with fabric scraps from my first Etsy sale, shoes embroidered with the words "Project Girl," the insult that became my brand. When the night arrived, I didn't wear designer. I wore the same denim skirt they once laughed at, except now it had gold thread, hand-stitched verses, and my signature on the hem. As I stood backstage, I heard someone say, "That's Alyssa James. She's the one that started in her kitchen." And someone else replied she didn't start there. She built from there. The lights dimmed, the music hit, and one by one, my pieces took the stage, not loud, not flashy, but honest and unforgettable. They didn't clap at first. They were too stunned. But when the final look came out, a hand-stitched trench with every past insult embroidered in gold, they rose. All of them. Even Jenna. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just nodded once, closed my eyes, and whispered to myself, thread by thread. I made this world mine. They called it a standing ovation. But to me, it felt like a reckoning. The kind of silence-breaking roar that echoed every laugh they once threw at me, every whisper, every dismissive smirk. Gone, replaced by applause. But here's what no one tells you about making it. It doesn't feel like a crown. It feels like breath returning to lungs that forgot what air tasted like. It feels like your younger self watching from the corner whispering, "We did it." After the show, interviews flooded in. Magazines that once wouldn't glance at me now begged for exclusive features. Podcasts, panels, brand collabs. I said no to most of them, not because I was arrogant, but because I knew who I was sewing for. And they didn't live in glass towers. They lived in one-bedroom apartments. They wore the same coat every winter. They patched up old shoes with duct tape. They needed more than fashion. They needed recognition, representation, reclamation. So I launched a program, Thread Forward, a mentorship initiative for young women from low-income backgrounds who wanted to learn fashion but didn't have the connections. I opened the studio every Saturday, taught them to sketch, drape, stitch, not just techniques, stories. I asked, "What does survival look like in fabric to you?" They answered with beauty I couldn't have imagined. One girl made a hoodie out of old protest banners. Another turned her family's eviction notice into a corset lining. Raw, real, sacred. Meanwhile, orders kept coming. Celebrities wore my jackets on red carpets. But I didn't post about it. I posted about the kids in Queens learning to hem a sleeve, the single mom who made her first sale, because that was the real runway. But fame has shadows, and mine came in the form of Jenna. She reached out again. This time, her tone changed. No sarcasm, no smugness, just desperation. Her label, once the darling of uptown fashion, was struggling. Critics said it lacked soul, that it felt recycled, unoriginal. She asked to meet for coffee. She wanted to collaborate. She used words like bridge and reconciliation. I agreed to meet her. Not to gloat, but because part of me needed to hear it, to know it wasn't just revenge. It was growth. She wore oversized sunglasses and a neutral palette. Still expensive, still flawless. But there was a tremble in her voice. She said, "I didn't understand your vision back then. But now, the industry's shifting. People want what you have." I stirred my coffee, said nothing. She continued, "We could co-design. A joint line. I'll bring investors. You bring the heart." I smiled, and in the calmest voice I could muster. I replied, "You once told me I dressed like a thrift store fantasy." She looked down. I leaned forward. But fantasies, Jenna, they build empires when you stop laughing. I declined her offer, and I paid for her coffee, not out of pity, but because power tastes best when served warm and quiet. That same week, I received an invitation. Paris Fashion Week, the big stage, the place I once stared at through cracked screens and magazine pages, and now my name was printed on the official lineup. Alyssa James Finale Collection. We flew out with 6 trunks, 30 looks. Every piece told a story of resistance, of patchwork, of being underestimated. The finale look, a floor-length cape, made entirely from letters photocopied, printed, and stitched of every rejection I'd ever received, handwritten notes from professors, dismissive critiques, even Jenna's first message. "Are you seriously submitting this?" I embroidered the word, "Thank you," over each one. When the cape hit the runway, the audience went silent. Then thunder. Applause like I'd never heard before. Not polite, not performative, but guttural, from the chest. That night, I stood outside the venue. The Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance. And I whispered to myself, "You did it. And you never had to wear their approval." But I wasn't done, because revenge isn't a single moment. It's a legacy. It's a door you kick open, then hold open for others. And mine was just beginning to swing wide. Success isn't a destination. It's a quiet revolution, one thread at a time. And mine had just begun. After Paris, the world opened. Japan, South Africa, Brazil. Fashion houses wanted interviews, collabs, deals. And sure, I said yes to some. But I said no to anything that tried to dilute the why, because I didn't build a brand. I built a voice for people who were never allowed to speak fabric. 1 month after Paris, I went back to Brooklyn, same subway line, same cracked sidewalk, but this time, I wasn't the girl walking with her head down. I was opening my first flagship store, on the very block where I once sold hand-stitched crop tops to passers-by for $15. The store wasn't sleek, it wasn't chrome, it was warm, brick walls, sewing machines in the back, a community library on the side, where customers could drop off books or take one home, and on the wall behind the register, stitched in gold, from survival to style. I hired local teens, single moms, people with no resumes but stories in their palms. I told them, I don't care where you worked, I care what you've lived, and the store thrived, not because it was trendy, but because it felt like home. For so many who never felt welcome in glossy boutiques. One day, an older woman came in, wearing a patched-up coat, holding a photo of a dress. She said, "My mother wore this during the war. I want to remake it for my granddaughter's graduation." I took the photo, and I cried, because this was what fashion was meant to do, not impress, but remember. A few months later, we hosted a showcase not on a runway, but in a church basement. Plastic chairs, paper flyers, homemade lemonade. But every piece on display had one thing in common. It was made by someone who'd once been told you don't belong, and now they were dressing each other in resilience. It didn't get press coverage, but it got something better. It got seen by the people who mattered. Then came the call. The Met. Not the gala. The exhibit. They were curating a new wing, American Stories in Fabric. And they wanted one of my original pieces, the trash bag gown. The same one they once laughed at. The same one Jenna said looked like a costume. Now preserved in glass, with a plaque that read, "Worn, discarded, transformed." Alyssa James reminds us that fashion isn't made in boardrooms, it's born in backyards. I brought my mom to the unveiling. She stood in front of the display, eyes wide. She whispered, "Your grandmother would be proud." And I, someone who had stood on global runways, cried harder than ever before. Not because of the Met, but because the little girl who used to stitch skirts from curtains had finally made it somewhere no one could erase her. I didn't stop. I launched new programs, a mobile sewing truck that toured low-income neighborhoods, workshops in juvenile centers, partnerships with shelters, everywhere I went. I asked one question, what does dignity look like when you wear it? And they answered not with words, but with design, raw, unfiltered, brave. Jenna tried again, this time through lawyers. She filed for design infringement, said I copied one of her coats. We went to court. She came in wearing all white. I came in with 3 of my interns as co-defendants, because the design in question wasn't mine. It was theirs, created in a workshop, built from thrifted linens, and Jenna had copied them. The judge ruled in our favor, publicly, and in the final statement, the court said, "Design cannot be divorced from origin. These works speak of survival. They are not imitations. They are lived truths." Jenna left quietly. She never reached out again. And me, I didn't celebrate. I just went back to the studio, hung a new sign above the door. This is not revenge. This is restoration. Today, my brand is stocked in 5 countries. But more importantly, it's worn in places no camera ever goes. On school buses, in kitchens, on stages, and yes, even in shelters. Because I believe fashion doesn't belong to the elite. It belongs to anyone who ever looked in the mirror and saw power in reflection. They made fun of my clothes, but I didn't just prove them wrong. I proved myself right. And that is a legacy stitched tighter than any seam they ever tried to unravel.